that's doing video recording, so be quiet.
So here we are with our next unit for world history. Good morning, everybody. Mr. Lamont's world history class, moving into unit 10. Let's take a quick second to set the stage for what we've been talking about. So we had a Renaissance, a Reformation, and an Age of Exploration. And those three huge events changed the world for good. And all of the changes that came as a result of those three big events helped lead to a scientific revolution in which not only the amount of knowledge changed, but how people sought knowledge. And that scientific revolution caused people to rethink the way they approached philosophy and government, which led to the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment changed the way people lived. We just had a whole unit on that, how the Enlightenment led to revolutions in America and France, led to colonies trying to escape out from under bigger countries, especially in Latin America, how Italy and Germany both finally created their nations, all out of the Enlightenment. Well, now we're going to talk about the effect of the scientific revolution, and how the scientific revolution is going to lead to the industrial revolution. The time when America changes not only where they live, but how they live and what they do. And the Industrial Revolution is going to lead to a time period called imperialism. Imperialism is when countries from one part of the world are going to basically start taking over the other countries around the world to get all of their raw materials, etc., so that they can then feed their Industrial Revolution. And if you look ahead a little bit, one of the main causes for World War I is going to be imperialism. And the number one cause for World War II is World War I. So we're setting up some pretty big stuff here between industrialization and imperialism. Now, our first question that we're going to deal with is, how did Europe, and more specifically, how did England win the race to industrialize? What does that look like? You know, is it little kids in factories and pollution and what else? So we're going to do this in two parts. The first part, we're going to focus on the first two Roman numerals here. What was life like pre-industry and what changed things? And where and what industrialized first? Now this will be on your outline. On the first page, you can break it into these three parts. We're going to do Roman numerals 1 and 2 now, and then we're going to do a chart and show a huge number of inventors and innovators, and then we'll talk about the impact. So let's move on to what was life like pre-industry and what changed things. Well, pre-industrial revolution, Europe was known for being entirely agricultural. Small towns, small villages, 80% of the people lived outside of the cities in very small towns, and even more so on small farms belonging to the manor. Remember our chessboard, our pawns, and our peasants? You know, the thing about today, in the United States, about 1% of our population lives on a farm. Whereas here, we're talking about 80% of the population lives on a farm. Now, what is this like in terms of production? Well, it's going to be inefficient. We're not going to have a huge supply of food. We're not going to have a huge variety of food. Low numbers of all these things. And as a result of that, our population is going to be low. And so the number one thing you want to remember pre-industrial revolution is low food supply, low variety, no surplus, and all that's going to help to cause low population. The other big thing we're talking about, this image represents, people didn't work in factories, they worked at the home. Everything you made in your shop. Maybe it was you lived above the shop and you worked down below, or maybe the shop was out back, but you did the work in your home, and that's called the cottage industry. Cottage is another name for somebody's home. And as you can see in this graph, before the Industrial Revolution hits, right in the early 1800s, population is pretty stagnant, not growing very fast. But notice once we hit the Industrial Revolution, right about here, look what happens to population. It's going to shoot up. That is a radically high shift. So what then, if this is what pre-industrial revolution Europe looked like, what causes to change it? What's the big change agents? Well, we're going to talk about how things change on the farm first. The first thing that changes is we become more scientific in our farming. Okay, so the first of 4 big changes, and that's going to be called crop rotation. Now, if you remember, during the Middle Ages, they started doing something that they referred to as the 3-field system, where you farm 2 fields and leave 1 fallow. You don't do anything there. Well, that helped the field to recover, but you weren't growing anything. With crop rotation, what they realized is if you just moved 1 crop to a different field each year, just the way chemistry works with agriculture, some crops take certain nutrients and some crops replace certain nutrients. And so between taking and replacing, you could actually give your fields better health by constantly farming them, as opposed to letting them lie fallow. Well, do the math. If I farm 3 fields, I'm going to have more food than if I farm 2 fields. And so as they began to rotate their crops, they started to produce more food. Well, more food means a surplus, means that you can also start to grow cash crops because you don't just have to grow food. So that's going to change a lot of what's going to happen in terms of the food supply. More variety, higher amounts. Number 2, the enclosure movement. Okay, you could see these interesting little pictures here. Notice all the small little lines here going around this village. Every one of those small little lines would represent a small farmer's ability to plant his own food. Well, people started getting greedy, and the rich started putting up fences. And these fences started to cut off all of those small farms and produce large farms. This was called the enclosure movement. And then as they began to enclose fields, they began to cut off some of these smaller, poorer farmers. They didn't have anything to do. They couldn't grow food. They couldn't figure out, jobs on these farms. And so a lot of them moved to the cities. Well, what are they going to do? They're in the cities. Well, when factories are going to start to open, they're going to be the factory workers. We'll just hold that thought for a little bit. All right, 3rd big change were new crops. Turnips. Everybody loves turnips, right? Everybody loves cloves. Everybody loves radishes. All these very interesting kind of side crops. Well, if you remember, thanks to remember what it was called when Columbus came to America and we started sending back and forth all these new crops and new ideas, the Columbian Exchange. So a lot of those food crops are starting to take hold. Potatoes in Ireland, remember? So we've got new crops to put into this crop rotation system. We've got large farms farming these. And then last but not least, we've got some new tools. Most importantly was the seed drill. You can see this right here. The seed drill was invented by Jethro Tull. And basically what it did was it planted seeds deeper in straighter lines without wasting the seeds. And it allowed one man to do multiple rows of seed planting at a time. Remember Jesus' parable? Sower goes out to sow the seed, just throws the seed out and hopes that it catches. Sometimes the bird get it, sometimes the weeds get it, sometimes the thorns get it, sometimes it falls on rocky soil. Well, Jethro Tull kind of killed that parable. He made it so the seeds went into the ground and the seeds were able to grow. Some other key new tools, etc., was there was a better iron plow, a plow that could go deeper, work lighter, fewer horses. And as we're going to be talking about here shortly, the first use of the most important energy source since muscle, since wind. We're going to be talking about steam and steam power. Okay, well, where do we have industrialization first? Okay, where is it going to begin? You have here an enrichment video. If you will Google causes of the Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, the site is ClickView. This is a quick screenshot of what it looks like. This will give you a good review of everything we just did and help you kind of see the beginning of the Industrial Revolution through the Agricultural Revolution. So England is first. Why is England going to be the first place to industrialize? Well, the key is they have the 4 things that you need in order to industrialize. So England's going to be first, starting around the 1750s through about the 1850. They're going to have the key ingredients for an industrial revolution. First up, they have lots of the natural resources needed for the Industrial Revolution. Most notably, large numbers of coal and large numbers of iron. Here's this map, which will help you see what we're talking about. Notice you see some colors, so use the key to figure out what colors are standing for. You see coal mines, iron factories, and then we'll be getting to textiles here in a moment. But the natural resources they have are iron and coal. As a matter of fact, there was so much coal in Newcastle that there's an expression that basically means we don't need any more, which says you bringing coals to Newcastle. That's like saying I'm bringing ice to an Eskimo. There was lots of coal. What's the most famous image of Mary Poppins? Of that chimney sweep covered in coal dust because they used the coal to heat their homes. So large numbers of coal and a large amounts of iron. So that's an example of the natural resources that England had in order to allow it to get out in front of this industrial revolution. Another thing that England had lots of was capital, money. Notice the little line graph here that shows money made by certain countries. Remember, mercantilism had taught the colony of the European countries that the most powerful countries were the ones that had money. Well, Britain learned that lesson well. Look at them outpacing everybody in Europe by a wide margin. Well, if you have capital, if you have money, you can start factories. You could pay workers. You could go out and buy natural resources. You could build all the infrastructure necessary in order to create a factory. So large amounts of capital, mostly because of mercantilism. And a side note, they're actually going to have some decent wages for a while. Okay, not going to last, but okay. Number 3, they have large numbers of colonies. This will be imperialism. We'll talk about this shortly. It's kind of a chicken and the egg deal. But everything you see in red belonged to England. Well, what natural resource are they going to lack with all of these colonies? Well, none. They're going to have everything they need. And this is that famous expression the British have about how big and strong and powerful they are. The sun never sets on the British Empire. You could see that the sun would always be shining on some aspect of the British Empire all around this area. And last but not least, the British are going to have a huge number of inventors, of innovators. Now, we're going to talk about these people specifically in part 2, but they had large numbers of people who came up with some great ideas that are going to help the Industrial Revolution to begin in England. Now, what? So that was the where. Now we want to talk about what. What was the first industry? Well, the first industry is going to be textiles. Textiles is a fancy phrase for cloth or garments. Okay, so a shirt, a dress, sheets for your bed. Those are all textiles. And before this, remember, cottage industry, you made your own clothes. You made them in the house. You used a spindle and a thread. Keep Cinderella away from this, right? But you just sat around and you stitched and you knit and you knit and you stitched. And so if you make your own clothes, are you going to have a lot of clothes? Not even. And if the population is low, do you need a lot of clothes to be made? No, not even. But now, here's a key point. The population is going up rapidly thanks to, what did we just discuss? The agricultural revolution. And as the agricultural revolution created more food means more people, More people means a demand for clothes. And so this population increase is going to cause a demand for clothing. Now, go back. What's going on in England? You have a huge number of inventors. You've got an industry ready to happen. All they need is a product. So one of the products they have is they're going to start making clothes to meet this demand with the population rising. So there's a huge number of inventors and innovations. Remember the expression, necessity is the mother of invention? Now that's what we're going to cover tomorrow. We'll start looking at all of these inventors and what they did. But each inventor invented one aspect of the industrial textile process, which made it then more likely that somebody would invent the next step to the process, and then the next step to the process. Of course, what is the number one fabric going to be used for these new textiles? Well, I'll give you a hint. It grows in the American South. It's going to be cotton. Cotton from India and cotton from the southeast of the United States are going to feed British textile mills. That's where it's going to come from. And the last key kind of aspect of what happens because of textiles is this global trade, this reliance on American cotton and Indian cotton is going to create an interdependence between England and the rest of the world. One aspect of the Industrial Revolution we're going to talk about is how the world becomes more in tune and needing the rest of the world in terms of a global economy. We're feeling that now with what we're dealing with the coronavirus. Okay, so for today, that's our focus. You can also take a quick look at the crash course from the Industrial Revolution. Does a good job previewing and highlighting some of the things that we're going to be talking about tomorrow as well. So that's going to end today's 10.1 part 1.